I had the pleasure of watching with my father a film from my youth, Michael Mann's The Last of the Mohicans. It is often remembered as a romantic epic, sweeping landscapes, heroic sacrifice, and a tragic love story set against the French and Indian War. Yet beneath its aesthetic power lies something far more severe, a meditation on the death of culture, the eclipse of virtue, and the transformation of war. Read in light of Christopher Dawson, especially Religion and Culture and Dynamics of World History, the film emerges as an unexpectedly precise diagnosis of modernity's spiritual costs. As a sociologist and a meta-historian, Dawson was acutely aware that societies are not sustained equally by all social institutions. Of the five fundamental spheres, family, education, religion, politics, and economics, he insisted that a civilization cannot be rebuilt from politics and economics alone. These may administer life, but they do not generate it. Society is formed by religion, expressed in the arts, and rendered intelligible by philosophy. This is Dawson's central claim. Cultures do not fundamentally live or die by economics, technology, or military power. They live or die by religion, understood broadly as a shared spiritual orientation toward reality. A culture survives only so long as it can transmit a common vision of life, embodied in ritual, moral imagination, memory, and a sense of ultimate meaning. Where that transmission remains possible, renewal is not only imaginable, but historically plausible. The Last of the Mohicans depicts precisely the moment when such transmission fails. The Mohican people are not wiped out in a single massacre. They are cut off from continuity. The death of the Uncas is decisive not merely because he is brave or noble, but because he is the last bearer of a living tradition. When Chingachgook mourns him in the final scene, he's not lamenting political defeat. He's witnessing the end of a world that no longer reproduces itself. Dawson recognized this immediately. In Dynamics of World History, he observes that traditional cultures often perish not through annihilation, but through the absorption into a civilizational system incapable of carrying their spiritual form. Modern civilization survives by abstraction, institutions, contracts, administration, whereas older cultures depended on embodied transmission, land, kinship, ritual, and memory. Once these are severed, survival becomes hollow. This cultural death has moral consequences, of course. The film is filled with virtuous characters, above all Uncas, but also Wake and Coramunro. Yet their virtue appears strangely homeless. Courage, loyalty, chastity, and self-sacrifice still certainly exist, but they no longer belong to a stable moral ecology. Here the film converges with Alasdair MacIntyre's diagnosis in After Virtue. Virtues can survive for a time as personal excellences even after the traditions that once sustained them have collapsed. Uncas's courage is real, but it has no future. There's no community left in which such courage can be taught, expected, or honored as a norm. It is admired precisely because it is exceptional and therefore doomed. Hawkeye survives, but only as a moral exile. He carries memory forward without being able to found a culture. Virtue detached from a living tradition becomes heroic rather than ordinary. Dawson warned that this is a hallmark of civilizational transition. Morality becomes individualized and nostalgic rather than socially formative. So the film's portrayal of war deepens this diagnosis. Indigenous warfare in The Last of the Mohicans still bears moral weight: memory, vengeance, responsibility, and personal risk. Violence is tragic but intelligible. Magua is not a nihilist. He's a man formed by a world in which injury demands reckoning. European war, by contrast, is procedural and administrative. Forts are surrendered by treaty, alliances broken by calculation, and lives exchanged for advantage. The most chilling moments are not battles, but negotiations, where moral responsibility dissolves into bureaucracy. From an Augustinian perspective, this marks a decisive shift. War, for St. Augustine, could only ever be justified as a tragic means ordered toward justice and peace. When war becomes a mechanism of control rather than an extension of moral order, it belongs fully to the civitas terrena. Dawson complements this insight historically. As civilizations expand, he notes, warfare becomes increasingly technical and impersonal, detached from moral formation of those who fight it. Violence no longer shapes character, it dissolves it. War becomes mechanical, just as citizenship becomes bureaucratic. This process was already visible in the late Roman world and reached a refined form in Byzantium. The rise of bureaucracy as a substitute for culture. Administration replaces participation. Regulation replaces virtue. An empire grows more complex, precisely as it grows more distant from the lives that once sustained it. At this point, a civilization loses contact with its rooted human types, the common citizen, the soldier, the peasant. Power is exercised through procedures rather than shared forms of life. Loyalty becomes compliance. Culture becomes management. The empire continues to function, but it no longer forms men. Modern Europe exhibits the same pathology. Like Byzantium, the European Union increasingly governs through impersonal norms and technical expertise. Authority is exercised far from ordinary lives. The result is not unity, but alienation, an empire detached from the cultures that formed it. Modern Europe is therefore no longer Christendom. It retains administrative coherence, but lacks the spiritual soul that once unified diverse peoples without erasing their differences. Recent maps show that in many European cities, the most common newborn names are now of Islamic origin, and this has provoked alarm or denial. Both reactions miss the point. These data do not primarily speak about Islam, they speak about Europe. To understand them, one must descend beneath demographics to the spiritual and cultural level. Here, three thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Oswald Spengler, and Christopher Dawson remain instructive. Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God was not a celebration, but a diagnosis of catastrophe. A civilization that severs its bond with transcendence hollows itself out. The hollow man, as we read in the Konic's works, the famous Belgian author. The last man, comfortable, risk-averse, and sterile, is effectively the result. Very hollow. It's a man who no longer sacrifices or generates. Spengler transformed this insight into a philosophy of decline. In The Decline of the West, he described the West as a civilization entering its terminal phase. Technique without a soul, declining birth rates, religion reduced to residue. His Faustian mechanistic analysis often appears prophetic, but it comes at the price of fatalism. Here Dawson proves decisive. Civilizations, he argues, do not die of biological old age, but of spiritual apostasy. What arises from a choice can be reversed by a choice. A culture without cult does not become neutral, it disintegrates. It no longer generates children, names, or reasons for existence. Seen this way, today's anxieties signal not conquest, but abdication. Civilization that ceases to believe also ceases to generate children, meaning, future. Their source has not dried up. It has just been abandoned. So at this point, a crucial distinction must be made between Oswald Spengler and Christopher Dawson. For Spengler, culture inevitably hardens into civilization through a quasi-mechanical process. Civilization is the final, exhausted stage of a culture's life, urban, technical, bureaucratic, spiritually sterile. Once this transition occurs, decline is irreversible. History follows necessity and not freedom. So Dawson decisively rejects this fatalism. For him, civilization is not in itself the enemy of culture, nor is its emergence a biological necessity or destiny. The decisive question is not whether a society becomes civilized, but whether its civilization remains animated by a living spiritual principle. Christian civilization, in Dawson's account, is not the suppression of cultures, but their redemption. It does not flatten differences or erase identities. It provides a soul capable of unifying diverse peoples without destroying their particular forms of life. This is very much rooted in the very understanding that Christianity has of the human person, the rational individual substance. The individuality does not get obliterated. The personal individuality does not get obliterated. And this happens also with cultures that are under the umbrella of this Christian civilization. And this is essentially the distinctive genius of Christianity. Just as grace does not annihilate nature, but heals and perfects it, so Christian civilization does not abolish the individual person or culture, but elevates them. Where Spengler sees civilization as a tomb of culture, Dawson sees in Christianity the possibility that civilization can become its guardian, provided it remains rooted in worship, moral imagination, and a shared orientation towards transcendence. So what ultimately triumphs in The Last of the Mohicans is not a better culture, but a more durable system. European powers will build states, archives, and institutions. The Mohicans leave behind memory, but memory entrusted to those who no longer inhabit it. This is Dawson's most unsettling insight. Modern civilization does not defeat rival cultures morally. It outlasts them biologically and forgets them spiritually. What survives is not culture, but nostalgia, beautiful and powerless. So the film is therefore not merely an elegy for a vanished people. It's a meditation on what happens when a civilization loses the men and women who once embodied it. When the common citizen, the soldier, and the peasant disappear, culture loses its human face. And what remains is administration without memory and rights without roots, which we so much all feel around us right now. Christianity, Dawson insists, is not a technique for managing decline, but a response to nihilism. I repeat, Christianity is not a technique for managing our decline, but it's a response to the nihilism. By affirming that life is a gift and a vocation, it keeps history open. As St. Augustine learned after 410 in the City of God, and as Europe rediscovered it after 1918, a civilization is not finally judged by the collapse of its institutions, but by the ordering of its loves. And if modern Europe remembers again the source of its faith, then the question posed by The Last of the Mohicans need not mark an ending, but the possibility of renewal still open within history. Thank you for your attention.